Hi, I'm Rajiv Rimal. I am currently an associate professor at Johns Hopkins University in the School of Public Health. I was trained in communication, and I am one of just a handful of people in the School of Public Health who have a communication background and are involved in doing public health work.
Okay, so a person who has a health concern or maybe a chronic condition or maybe just a general health concern, what are the communication principles that could help them be a better consumer of information or perhaps talk in a more effective way with their healthcare provider?
Well, I work with the assumption that communication is central to what we do, both in terms of how we lead our general lives as well as what things come into focus for us when we have particular health needs. If we think about the interaction that takes place between us and our doctors in our doctor's offices, that's all about communication. Are we able to communicate our concerns properly, effectively? Does our physician pay attention? Does he or she ask us a lot of questions? Do they appear as though they are concerned about our health? All these are communication-related activities, and so my concern as a communication researcher, we're doing work in a health context, is how can we effectively promote better use of communication skills? How can we train our physicians to be better communicators? How can we train patients to communicate more effectively? So that's on a one-to-one kind of basis, when you're talking with your physician. But communication is not just one-to-one, it's also one-to-many quite often, or many-to-one. And so in the larger public health world, with the emphasis on public, communication occurs, for example, from, say, the government distributing information about salmonella poisoning to millions of people, some of whom may be completely unaware about the issues at stake. Others may be very aware of what's going on and they're seeking more subtle kinds of information. So you've got to have skills that will allow you to reach this very broad spectrum of people with very different needs, very different appetite for information, some of whom may not be concerned at all and should be. So that's an example of one-to-many kind of communication. But there are also examples of many-to-one. When there is widespread panic in a community because there's an oncoming hurricane or some bad weather or some concern like that, how do people express their grievances? How do people express their fears, their concerns? How do they communicate with their children? I mean, all these are very central communication kinds of questions that we in the field of health communication, but also in the larger communication field, need to pay attention to so that we can become advocates, we can become important, reliable, credible sources of information to the public.
Okay. I think the public sometimes has problems in discerning what is the accurate communication or the accurate information. Do you have any advice for consumers of health information, or when they hear a public announcement about some crises, how do they discern what is the real information versus not real information?
Right. So it might be helpful to think about something that people who do communication research have been thinking about for many, many years, which is this idea of source credibility. And what that often means is who is disseminating this particular information. We are not, as laypersons, very often terribly concerned about it, or we don't look at the fine print to see who is publishing this information for what purpose. So I would say paying attention to where that information is coming from is probably the first step. So is it coming from a pharmaceutical industry that is trying to push a particular pill? Is it coming from my physician? Is it coming from the Centers for Disease Control? Is it coming from the National Institutes of Health? I think the source of the information is certainly a very important piece of that puzzle, and as we try to figure out what information is credible and what information is perhaps being pushed with a particular agenda in mind. Apart from the source of the information, we might also want to look at, is this information presenting just one point of view, or is it acknowledging sort of the other side, the other points of view? So any source of information or any information that's out there that speaks to, hey, this is my point of view, if you want an alternate point of view, go to this particular place. So when that kind of guidance is provided, I personally tend to ascribe that with a greater amount of credibility. To say, okay, so they're presenting me with their point of view, but they're also telling me where I can go for additional information. And now, with websites, I think, especially for people who are looking to verify information that's out there, there are just endless sources of information. So I think I would say that it sort of depends on what kinds of information we're looking for, where that information is coming from, and what we are really going to do with that information. Are we using that information to better inform our aging mother about the precautions she needs to take so she doesn't fall down and break her hip? Or are we looking for information so that we can feel more empowered to talk to a teenager who may be struggling with normative pressures from his or her peers to do certain things? So I think the objective of what we are trying to do also makes a big difference.
Okay. So what I hear you say, though, is that the source of the information and is one of the things that you look for in terms of credibility, but also that if that information source suggests you go somewhere else, that also increases the credibility for you. Is there any last advice you'd give to consumers of information at the public health level?
Apart from the credibility of information, I guess I would say that there are many efforts out there, campaigns and so forth, that promote changing certain kinds of behaviors, that try to change norms around the prevailing practices. So for example, if we look at I'll choose smoking as a very good example of public health success, where the kinds of efforts that were being undertaken, say, even 50 years ago, look very different from what we see today. And then we look around us and the norms have also changed quite a bit. So, the kinds of influence that, for example, the tobacco industry used to have is not anywhere as strong, at least not in the U.S. Internationally it may be a different story, but not in the U.S. It's not that influence is not as extensive. But that is not to say that those kinds of efforts are not being undertaken. They're being undertaken, but under the radar quite often and in more subtle ways. And so we might look at, these attempts at influence do not have to be very direct. They can be very indirect. So if we're watching a film, what is the flashing neon over my shoulder that is promoting a particular product? So there are other ways in which this kind of influence occurs as well. And I think an informed consumer is probably a better consumer, everything else being the same.
All right. Thank you so very much.
No problem at all.